Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before entering into what I came here to say, I regret that the vitriolic outburst by a panelist resorted to a blatant misrepresentation of facts and recycled a false narrative being peddled by his countries for its own narrow political purposes and petty territorial ambitions. This is a disappointing misuse of this platform. Pakistan has raised an issue that is internal to India. As an opposition parliamentarian, I have raised and will continue to debate Kashmir and other questions with my own government in the exercise of my democratic rights as an MP. But the kind of statement we heard from a Pakistani diplomat today is distinctly unhelpful. It is particularly ironic that a state that is responsible for inflicting countless cross-border terrorist attacks on Jammu and Kashmir is trying to masquerade as a champion of international law. Pakistan is the only government in the world that provides a pension to an individual listed by the United Nations in the Al-Qaeda and Daesh sanctions list. Pakistan is home to 130 United Nations designated terrorists and 25 terrorist entities listed by the United Nations. It is frankly absurd to hear fulminations about respect for human rights from a representative of such a state when terrorism is the worst possible destroyer of human rights. I do want to say that we expect better from an IPU forum than this kind of vituperative mudslinging. We're here to discuss a serious issue of respect for international law in a constructive spirit. We hear Pakistan referring to UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, but it very conveniently forgets its own obligations under the very first of those resolutions to first vacate its illegal occupation of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. It has blatantly disregarded its other commitments under international law, whether under the 1972 Shimla Agreement or the Lahore Declaration of February 1999. People in glass houses, Mr. Chairman, should not throw stones. But I will instead return to the issue we're here to talk about this afternoon. And I would like to mention to the distinguished delegates that the Constitution of India is unusual in that it specifically attaches importance to international legal obligations by providing in Article 51 to endeavour to foster respect for international law, I'm quoting here, and treaty obligations in the dealings of organised peoples with one another. In other words, respect for international law and the United Nations Charter is therefore a constitutional obligation in India. And the Indian Parliament has passed legislation to adopt UN regulations and resolutions as domestic law. India is convinced of the need for the United Nations to continue to improve its capabilities in the field of peacekeeping and to enhance the effective and efficient deployment of its peacekeeping operations. As I was the United Nations official responsible at headquarters for our operations in the former Yugoslavia from 1991 to 1996, I know all too well that peacekeeping cannot work where there is no peace to keep. India itself has the largest cumulative number of troops contributed to the United Nations. We've always stood for peaceful mediation in conflict situations and impartiality and non-arbitrariness in the resolution of disputes. We view the significance of UN resolutions in the maintenance of a rule-based order in trade, maritime transport, security and strategic matters. But our long-standing demand of reforming the composition and role of the Security Council and global affairs and conflict resolution cannot be overlooked. Respect for international law suffers if the Security Council is widely seen as unrepresentative, and therefore its decisions can be disrespected as illegitimate. This must not be allowed to happen. India looks forward to working with other like-minded states on this matter. On the issue of sanctions, I do want to thank Professor Bestaker for an excellent presentation. While we accept that targeted sanctions sometimes work in the manner in which he describes, we would find it impossible to justify comprehensive sanctions against any state, since they harm innocents far more than the rulers they are aimed at, who are always insulated from their worst effects. A tool that harms the vulnerable in any country is not one the United Nations should be resorting to. In conclusion, and I'm skipping a lot of my points simply because of the lack of time, I would like to state that parliaments are the national bodies best placed to prevent violations of international law and the rule of law. Parliaments can be key partners to help in preventing conflicts and other negative impacts on the well-being of their own citizens and ensuring sustainable and inclusive development. And we as parliamentarians can help by legislation, obviously, to prevent or remedy human rights or rule of law violations, by debates in Parliament and public education that follows, and in our own parliamentary committees by monitoring and acting to improve our member states' progress in meeting their obligations under international treaties and conventions. So there is an onus on all of us to do a better job of keeping our states accountable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.